I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. This is video number 6 in our series on Terrapsychological Inquiry, which is our earth-honoring research methodology for studying the intimacy with which not only the natural world, but also the built environment occupies a place inside our own consciousness. So for more on that, and for an overview of how to use the methodology, see the first video in the series. So in this one, I want to talk a little bit about how to find a research question, and I should say a little bit too about how not to, in the sense of we tend to like research questions that are exciting, significant, that involve us at all levels. And what sometimes happens is researchers pick questions that they think they should study, and they always turn out to be boring. Or just, oftentimes I'll read a research proposal and I'll see the question and I'll think, why do you want to do this anyway? And so I'll ask the student, why this? And if the student has a lot of passion for that question, then I think, okay, good, that's great. But what often happens is somebody will say, well, I just thought this was the question I should study. And then I ask, why did you think you should study that? And then we go into that discussion. Oh, it'll help advance my career, or oh, it's because what my teachers expect, or blah blah blah. Those tend to be difficult to work on long term. It tends to be difficult to enlist the necessary motivation for picking up a question that at heart really isn't yours. The question that you think you should ask and the research you think you should do often is an agenda from outside. And even when that's the case, even if, for instance, you were using Terrapsychological Inquiry for some project that you needed to do either in the academic world or in the business world or in some other world, the world of nonprofit ecological advocacy, in those cases it's important to respect the agenda of the place where you're working, but simultaneously to make the research your own, to make the question your own, and to find the part of the topic that you study that excites you and lights you up. Unless you do that, it's going to be really heavy going. So whether you're in that kind of a context or you have a relatively free reach in terms of what to pick for a research interest topic, and you want to do something that involves the ecological dimension of things, the earth dimension, the nature dimension, or studying the built environment, then you've got some spaciousness and some room to actually come up with something that you like. So how do you do that? So first of all, what I recommend doing is to actually sit down and write down a list of what you've recently studied or worked on that you're passionate about, that really lights you up, that really has an edge place for you. And make a list of those things. It's a wish list. And eventually, when you get them all down on paper, you'll be in a position to go through them again and maybe combine this one with that one, or say which of these excites me the most. This project isn't going to be done overnight. It's going to take months or years for me to work on. So for months and years, which one of these has the best chance of holding my interest? And then pick that one. And then you massage it a bit to get it in the form of a research question. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But so first off, going by what excites you, what drives you, what do you have to know? That's a good way in. In all these things that you've been studying or looking into, or if you're working out there in the world beyond higher ed, what is it that really preoccupies you? That might be the source of your question. Now, if it isn't, there's a number of other things that you can do. One involves a kind of fantasy. And in terrapsychological work, we like the imagination. So fantasy should be something that you're on good terms with or need to be anyway. So what you do in this case, in a previous video I mentioned whole person research that engages the unconscious, that engages the deeper aspects of who we are. So in terms of talking to that side of yourself and asking it for fantasies about what to study, a lot of my students work with dreams. They incubate dreams, and so before you go to sleep at night, asking whatever you think of as your unconscious or the back of your head or whatever, what would be interesting to work on? What aspect of the world is really calling out to me right now? So that is a good direction to go in. Sometimes, and I've had this happen to myself, you're stuck for a research question. You have an academic deadline or a work deadline or whatever it is, and you're really not sure what to study. And then something happens, and here's where another fantasy comes in. Not just fantasies that arise in dreams or what have you, but in this fantasy, you're thinking of the work, of your future work, what your research question is going to develop into eventually as its own entity in your consciousness. It's kind of like its own psychical being. Jungians would call it a semi-autonomous complex. The seeds of the future are deep within us, not only the relics of the past. So whatever direction you're going to go in, and whatever is going to come of that is already in there in some form or another. You merely have to figure out where it is. So oftentimes what happens is when you're working on, what should I study? Very often it exists in your life somewhere already. Maybe it's a relationship that recently failed. Maybe it's a work situation that confronted you with something surprising. Maybe it's even an illness or a change in your family or what have you. So what I always ask my students to do when they're stuck for a research question is, why don't you survey what's been happening in your life over the last 6 months, few months, since you've been in the program, whatever, and look for shifts, and then look deeper and see if there's something in the shift that suggests a research question on the level of symbolic beckoning. If something's breaking down, does that hint somehow that you're going to study breakdown in another arena, maybe the breakdown of relationships in a neighborhood or ecological breakdown or what have you? If something is renewed, if it gains new life, is there another kind of renewal that you will be preoccupied with in your work? So those kinds of questions and the ability to think symbolically, to track the metaphors that are happening as they unfold in your life. So that's another way to get onto the research question. And then another suggestion, also involving a fantasy, is the fantasy that your question, being a psychical being, animal, whatever you want to think of it as, is also looking for you. It wants to be born. It wants to come into being. So it's not just a matter of looking for a research question, of the conscious mind saying, I want to do this or do that. It's also a matter of simply maintaining openness and mental flexibility, scanning yourself, being in tune with your feelings in your body, being aware of what's changing in your surroundings, so that you are at a state of maximum receptivity for when the question finds you. Now, I've been saying research question. I could equally have been saying research topic. And one of the goals of the work is to turn the topic, the area that excites you, into a good research question. So a few things about that. One is almost everybody doing qualitative research in particular starts out with a research question that's far too broad. So that's okay if you have some time to develop it a little bit, that's fine. And in fact, sometimes the research topic has to expand a bit, and then you go and do your homework and go see things and do some reflection. And then gradually, this is the ideal case, gradually it contracts itself to the point where it says, okay, this is what I want to be as a topic. So that's if you have enough time. Sometimes though, especially if you're a graduate student, you have deadlines coming up, academic deadlines, and you've got to settle on something. You've got to write a proposal or a concept paper or whatever it is and get moving. So in that case, you might have to be a little bit more forceful in narrowing down your topic. Now, somebody who was one of my research advisors when I was a student, Elizabeth Nelson at Pacifica, is fond of saying there's no such thing as too small a topic. That's good advice. And her own dissertation on the image of Psyche's knife from the old folktale is a good example. So if you can think of it in terms of what particular part of this topic can I take on right now and leave the rest for later. So there's a technique that's sometimes used in the business world called the parking lot. It's used for group meetings. And in the parking lot, you're under discussion with a certain point. in a room full of people, and then somebody brings something up that doesn't bear directly on it, but it's still really important. So you write that on the other side of the board under a category that says for later or even parking lot, and you explain to people, if we have time later, we're going to come back to this. And in the case of, let's say, a work project or a dissertation or a master's degree or what have you, it may turn out that that's not directly relevant to whatever your thesis or research question turns out to be. In which case, that's what work after graduation is for. Graduating is good. You don't want to overburden yourself with a topic that's so huge and a research question that's so unfocused that you can just never get to the end of the inquiry. That's how a lot of people get stuck, by the way. So you want to, at some point when you've done enough homework on the topic, condense down the research question into something doable. And one thing to be aware of too, a cautionary, oftentimes people who are in a program that focuses on the transformation of consciousness, such as programs that I like to work in, have another fantasy, which is the fantasy that what the work I'm doing is going to transform the maximum number of people, so I have to make it applicable to all possible audiences. You will never graduate if you do that. The more specifically you can visualize this audience, that audience, maybe 3 or 4, if that many, then the more you'll be able to focus your research question, because keep in mind that that question is the pivot on which your entire inquiry will turn. So if the research question is ambiguous, unclear, or unfocused, then your study will be too. Now that doesn't mean that the research question needs to be answerable in simple terms, and it certainly shouldn't be answerable as a yes or a no. But it can be open-ended too, that's perfectly okay. But it has to have enough focus so that when you select methods with which to study, then it's doable. All right. The last thing I'll say in this video concerns levels of involvement, and they vary widely. It's almost like there's a spectrum of emotional involvement in the topic where on one end it's primarily a matter of ego level involvement where, and I don't mean ego in a negative sense, I mean it in the sense of the conscious mind, saying to itself, well, it would make good sense if I took this as a career move and studied this, and I am interested in it, I am passionate about it, and then once I graduate, this can actually help me do the work that I know I'm going to be doing in the world. So outside of academia, this looks basically like a work project or a community project. So the other end of the involvement spectrum is that you are utterly possessed by the topic, it's all you can think about, and it's burning you up until you finally get it done. So there are advantages to both. I tend to favor the second one just because it happened to me. And it's so exciting to get possessed by a topic. It just lights up your whole life. But you have to be careful that you have adequate self-care, that you have lots of support, that you have a good team of co-researchers or just people who are looking in on you, and that you have times in your life devoted to things like leisure and self-care and all that, even if you're busy. Because if you get too obsessed, it's not only harmful to you and your relationships, it's harmful to your topic too. So with that said, I hope a research question or topic finds you and gives you plenty of animation and plenty of motivation for moving forward into the study.